Yes, greetings again, Bantu Baguti. So, without any waste of time, I hope that everyone is still okay in this particular time that we find ourselves in, fighting this thing that we are busy trying to fight here. So, I am going to continue with the next section in the very same chapter of this book. Hani, Life Too Short. You'll remember that last time we were reading part one of the chapter called the Memorandum, which is basically a chapter that tries to contextualize the situations that led to the writing of the memorandum itself. As a way of joining up from where we left last time, I would love to just read the last lines from the previous section. Basically, this is where Mkotsi receives a visitor in the name of Mzwai Piliso, who has been sent to come, or had come to talk to his Fort Hare classmate, the intellectual that is Mkotsi, to actually try to talk to Chris Hani and his comrades to actually dissuade them from pursuing the writing of the memorandum. So we left last time where Mkotsi or Mzwaipilis was explaining that I've been sent here by the leadership, and he said this boy is mine, and he desperately waved a document in his old friend's face, and that document was the memorandum. So I continue to read from there. After Hani returned to Lusaka from detention in Botswana, he spent much of his time at Lutuli camp, which was 130 kilometers out of the city. At first, he did not talk about what had happened in Wanki, but later he addressed the men in the camp, telling them about the glorious victories won during the campaign and the time spent in prison. He gave advice on what to avoid should any of them be involved in similar situations, in similar missions. The men enjoyed the vivid accounts that Hani told in their distant camp with little to occupy them other than military routine. In their distant camp, with little to occupy them than military routine, feelings of isolation were not uncommon. From here, the familiar sounds of Radio South Africa could be heard on radio, and people coming from Lusaka would bring newspapers. Every column, inch of local Zambian and international news was devoured by this eager audience. Still, there had been no briefing session, no formal call from MK leadership, and therefore the ANC and SACP leadership for those who had survived Wanki. No one had officially asked them to share their experiences. Even more disheartening was the fact that no other missions seemed imminent. The battle-hardened cadres were in a state of limbo, basically. In the meantime, all that was visible to the rank and file was the leadership, flying from world capital to world capital, enjoying the high life. They thought that they were going to just upload everything they did and say hallelujah, he recalled. Instead, we blew our tops. As news spread by word of mouth and copies of the now famous memorandum started circulating, a certain fear ran through ordinary members of the ANC. Never before, not in their time as members of the organization, had the movement been challenged so sharply from within. The document would surely do irrevocable damage. The contents of the memorandum was pulled apart and criticized by the groups in conversation. The language was crude. It was not ANC. It was tribalist. All the signatories come from Transkei. Still, many agreed with the main sentiment. The struggle had indeed stagnated, with the leaders flitting about the world stage. Facetious remarks about telephone guerrillas and chicken in the basket revolutionaries seem to have a basis in fact. But in the ANC's culture of consensus, so carefully fostered by Tambo, many felt that making the memorandum public was tantamount to an open rebellion. In the end, two documents emerged. A second memorandum detailed the background of the first. There was a view that although the second document had been produced by Hani and his comrades, Jack Simons had assisted them, it was agreed that the group's independence had to be asserted. So 3 of the signatories were sent out to interview Tumanoko, while arrangements were made to discuss a meeting with other members of the executive. An incensed Nokwe, who was enraged at being singled out and who felt his wife had been vilified, was predictably hostile. He tried to deflect attention from the real issues, saying that these were trivial. He insisted on seeing the signatories as individuals, not as a group, and asked his representative to arrange the meeting with the NEC. Eventually, 6 members of the NEC met as a delegation, and copies of the memorandum were prepared. These were first typed, stenciled and duplicated, and then given to members of the executive and select members of MK, with the latter cautioned to be careful with the fire they had in their possession. The signatories were to have a second meeting with the executive. But this time, representatives from military headquarters and the regional administration were present. The executive had explained that they had been summoned because the memorandum was now also in the hands of soldiers. But almost immediately, some of the military men grew threatening. To this day, there are rumors that dire punishment and even to death sentence was mooted. Dungeons were said to have been dug, perhaps upon the orders of Mdise or even Nokwe, but an upset Tambo ordered that these be closed. He wanted the matter to be discussed again and insisted a meeting be convened for this purpose. His view was that the memorandum was not the work of the 8 signatories, but rather the men were being used as proxies by others who were as yet unknown. Eventually, a military tribunal consisting of NEC members, Mzwai Piliso, Jonas Mtlo, and former PAC member Sipom Tembu, was convened in Livingston, and a majority voted for the execution of the signatories to the memorandum. Despite his formidable reputation, Piliso is said to have been the person whose determination and intervention saved Hani and others from the firing squad. Others say it was Ray Simons. Apparently, she heard about the decision of the tribunal and was livid. She took on Thomas Nkobi, then the ANC's chief representative in Zambia, and said there would be serious consequences if anything happened to Hani. Having heard the news of the possibility of execution, Hani's father, in parenthesis, in Lusaga, Livingstone, Mkotsi, launched his own appeal to the East German and Soviet ambassadors. He wanted them to use their influence to stop the ANC from killing these young men. Even at this relatively early stage of Hani's life, a legion of admirers came to his rescue. Finally, The NEC met and overruled the tribunal, even though the decision to punish the men had been confirmed at the Morogoro conference in late April 1969. The men attached to the memorandum were suspended from the organization, but a hornet's nest had been stirred up. The fact that there were some, notably within the NEC, who had paid for the blood of Hani and his cahoots clearly showed that the leadership did not like being criticized. So although the knock in the dead of night at Nkosi's door did not ultimately lead to Hani's assassination, Hani's imprisonment or death, it did compel a rearguard action on behalf of the NEC. Vocal in this were the likes of leading SACP members, Joe Slovo and Yusuf Dadu. By the time 70 delegates had gathered in Morogoro, Tanzania, on the 25th of April 1969, from stations across the world, 41 African states had gained independence. But Mozambique, Angola, Southwest Africa, Rhodesia, and South Africa were still in bondage. The countries of Southern Africa have not yet broken the chains of racism which hold them in oppression, read a statement adopted at the conference. The ANC affirmed its purpose at Morogoro. Certainly it was a revolutionary movement which had adopted an armed struggle, but its battles were primarily political. The use of force was something not entered into lightly. The organization's goals was not militarism. For the ANC, political leadership was the sublime good. All other structures were subordinate, as it was felt strong that the armed struggle alone could not bring about success. The propaganda of the apartheid regime was fierce and had to be countered. At Morogoro, where race issues were played out to devastating effect, it was clearly spelled out that whites were unified as the enemy, with the ANC in unison that all significant sections of white political movement are in broad agreement on the question of defeating our liberation struggle. It argued that the battle along color lines had been created by the enemy, and the tragic consequences of it would be hard to eliminate. In a different situation, the working class might have come to understand that its fate was intertwined with that of the black working class. Or at the same time, the conference called on the liberation movement to assist in breaking the policy of racial domination. It reads, our policy must continually stress in the future, as it has in the past, that there is room in South Africa for all who live in it, but only on the basis of absolute democracy. Quote, the mainstay of the conference and these statements was the strategy and tactics document engineered by Joe Slovo, which secured the recognition that the main aim of the revolution was the national liberation of the African people as the most oppressed group, a belief which should govern every aspect of the struggle. There was a powerful call for unity among oppressed people, lauding the sacrifices of the likes of Basil, Fabre, and many Indian and colored political prisoners. We are revolutionaries, not narrow nationalists, stated the document. Continues, committed to revolutionaries are our brothers or are our brother to whatever group they belong. There can be no second-class participants in our movement. The strategy and tactics document then looked forward to the eventual emancipation of the masses of South Africa, arguing for economic and political emancipation, as the first phase of the military struggle, to allow the existing economic forces to retain their interest intact is to feed the root of the racial supremacy and does not represent even the shadow of liberation. I read the document. Hani saw, however, that the memorandum, which was necessarily suppressed in favor of the strategy and tactics document, had had a more immediate effect. In the aftermath of the conference, the allowance paid to members of the leadership, which he and other signatories had found so repugnant, was stopped, and a number of camp commanders were removed from their positions. The movement was tightening its belts and refocusing itself on primary mission. By the time the week-long conference came to an end, the ANC had decisively reinvigorated itself and the liberation movement, deciding, with renewed vigor to infiltrate South Africa, both militarily and politically. But other African governments were seriously wavering in their resolve to isolate the apartheid and colonial regimes. Although not militarily successful, the battles of Wankie and Spolilo, a second MK Zipra infiltration campaign lasting from December 1967 to July 1968, had sent a clear message. The liberation movements were inextricably intertwined and were ready to confront the enemy with force. However, barely 2 weeks before Morogoro, the 5th Summit Conference of East and Central African States had produced the Lusaka Manifesto, which dealt a crushing blow to the liberation movements of Southern Africa. For more than a year, as Zambian President Kenneth Kaunda had been engaging South African apartheid leader John Vorster in talks about normalizing relations in return for the release of Mandela and engagement with the liberation movements. The Lusaka Manifesto, which took this into account, was believed to have been largely authored by Julius Nyerere and was eventually adopted by the OAU and the United Nations General Assembly. The manifesto declared, if peaceful progress to emancipation were possible, or if changed circumstances were to make it possible in the future, we would urge our brothers in the resistance movement to use peaceful methods of struggle, even at the cost of some compromise on the timing of change, unquote. But the liberation movements read it differently. It seemed the African heads of states were threatening to pull the plug on the armed struggle in return for a protracted withdrawal of oppressive colonial and apartheid rule. The ANC leadership responded with deafening silence. Since Zambia was hosting the African National Congress and several other liberation organizations, they could hardly allow themselves to fall foul of Kaunda. But the African leaders changed their tune a year later at their conference in Khartoum. The colonial and apartheid regimes of Portugal, Rhodesia, and South Africa had not taken up the invitation to hold discussions with the respective liberation organizations in their countries, prompting the heads of states to again increase their support of the revolutionaries. Watching now from the sidelines, disillusioned but still involved in the history unfolding before him, Hani tried to make sense of the politics in play. In an interview with that later appeared in Maibuye, he is documented as saying, I quote, "We were all bitter about Lusaka Manifesto, about the negotiations between Kaunda and Vorster, but we thought it would be wrong to denounce Kaunda for a number of reasons. Though he was continuing with these negotiations, he was keeping us in Zambia. And for us, this was important. So we had to weigh up our priorities. We thought, let him. He was entitled to do what he was doing. But basically, it was important for us to retain Zambia as a base for the ANC in order to continue with our strategy. That was Kaunda's strategy. He was not hostile to the ANC because he was talking to Foster. We felt let down, you see. We would have preferred a situation where Africa would totally isolate the apartheid regime, because this was our strategy, that South Africa must be isolated continentally and internationally. But we knew that some African leaders were having secret talks with the regimes because of their dependence on South Africa economically, and the fact that they traded South African goods. I think Kaunda this time had problems with Smith, because Smith had declared unilateral independence and Zambia had closed its borders and everything with Smith. I think he was playing South Africa against Zimbabwe in order to ensure that Zambia, which was a landlocked country, did not suffer the long-term effects of the blockade that Zambia, with the support of the international community, had imposed on Zimbabwe. On reflection, though, 1969 was marked not so much by strategy and tactics or the Lusaka Manifesto. By far, the most influential catalyst for far-reaching decisions was the Memorandum. As Hani said later to Wolfie Kodesh, our detractors would not say that we had contributed, but if we had not spoken out, in my view, there would have been no Morogoro conference. Our criticism created a crisis within the movement which jolted them, and again prompted a clear definition of the objectives of the African National Congress. The ANC began to say the working class is the backbone of our struggle, and I would want to believe that our erratic, if you like, criticism and anger did contribute to this sort of thing. The post-Morogoro ANC depended more on developing revolutionary structures inside South Africa to mobilize the masses. Importantly, you see, the rank and file, and the rank and file had gained in stature. So I think it's important for the interest of the recording to stop here, so that we get a chance to also now continue with the final installment of this chapter, after which then it will be important to go straight to the memorandum and actually try to understand, or will be in a better position by then to understand what is about to come really in the memorandum, when we know for now in the rough sketch and the bigger picture that it was a memorandum of demand that actually was as a result of the shenanigans, if you like, that were happening within the African National Congress in exile at the time. So I think let us pause here, then we'll continue with the part 3 of this chapter 7, the memorandum of a book, Hani, A Life Too Short. Thank you, comrades.